this Lunch and Learn session on speeding up your website, hosted in collaboration with Jewellerybox, who are officially the fastest fashion website in the UK. So my name's Camilla. I'm the content marketing manager here at Fresh Relevance. My job involves a lot of researching, writing, and talking about e-commerce. And I'm joined today by Nathan from Jewellerybox.
Hi.
Hi, Nathan. Thanks for joining us today.
No problem.
So we'll have time for questions after today's presentation. We'll have about 15 minutes Q&A session. So if you do have any questions, please pop them in the question box, which you should see on the right-hand side of your screen. We'll try to get around to every question, and if we don't, then we might be able to answer them after the session as well. So first of all, a quick bit about who we are. Fresh Relevance is a best-of-breed personalization platform that automates customer experience and decisioning using a versatile range of tools that can integrate seamlessly with your existing tech stack. Our platform helps you improve conversion rate and retention by ultimately delivering a more personalized and valuable experience to your customers. Our platform also facilitates cross-team collaboration and maximizes efficiency because it's highly accessible to people across different teams, helping you build a better and more consistent customer experience. Some product features include cross-channel personalization, dynamic images, product recommendations, data capture popovers, triggered emails, geo-targeting, social proof, and much more. We also offer testing, targeting, and optimization to make sure your personalized customer experience is the best it can be. Ultimately, we help digital marketers achieve their goal of boosting loyalty and revenue by creating an optimized customer journey across all channels and devices. And in fact, on average, our customers see 25% of their online sales influenced by Fresh Relevance. So we're trusted by hundreds of leading digital businesses across retail, publishing, and travel. Hopefully you recognize some familiar names there, and you can see some businesses you relate to. So on to the good stuff, why we're all here today, site speed. Why is it so important, and why is it such a hot topic right now? Well, site speed is a key factor when it comes to customer experience. And I'm sure most of us have experienced that frustrating feeling of waiting for a website to load. And in fact, Kissmetrics have actually found that 47% of consumers expect a web page to load in 2 seconds or less, and 40% of consumers will actually abandon a website that takes more than 3 seconds to load. On top of all that, Google are pushing towards page experience as a key ranking factor, meaning online businesses are prioritizing site speed in a bid to increase or maintain their visibility on the search engine results pages. Last year, Google announced the introduction of Core Web Vitals. I'm sure you've all heard about it. It's an update to their algorithm focused on page experience, which is set to be released this summer. The Web Vitals program provides unified guidance for quality signals that Google believes are essential to delivering an optimal user experience on the web. The set of signals are called Core Web Vitals, and they measure 3 important aspects of user experience on the web. So those are loading experience, interactivity, and visual stability of the page content. And there's a metric for each aspect. Let's take a quick look at the 3 metrics in more detail. So firstly, largest contentful paint measures that when the page's main content is likely loaded. Nathan will be talking. Then we have first input delay, which measures responsiveness and quantifies the experience users feel when trying to interact with your page. Then finally, we have cumulative layout shift, which measures visual stability and quantifies the amount of unexpected layout shift of visual page content. Pages that receive a score of good across the Core Web Vitals metrics will be viewed by Google as achieving an aspirational level of user experience, and those pages might get a boost in the search engine rankings. So now I'm going to hand over to Nathan to talk about Jewellerybox's incredible journey to becoming the fastest fashion website in the UK.
Hi, Camilla, thank you. And hi, everybody. Let me just flick over to my screen to share so you can see my slides. Sorry, just bear with me 1 second.
Yeah, no worries.
Okay, is that working?
Yeah, that looks great.
Perfect. So why page speed? So thank you, Camilla, for your intro. Just a bit about me first. My role is to look after the website Jewellerybox, which has me wearing many hats, from SEO, managing Google Ads, data analysis, and leading any website improvements. So I'm very much a generalist, but I enjoy a kind of deep dive into how websites work and how users interact with them. So for a small business with limited development resources, page speed's been something that's taken up a lot of their valuable time for us over the years. So why did we invest so much in it? So here's some of our reasons. The first one is our customers like it. And this was our biggest reason. We actually surveyed our customers about 3 years ago. And one of the most common complaints was the site's too slow. And that's a hard thing to hear for us. And it was sort of the start of a big journey. So customers were really the sort of main focus here. The second one is that Google likes it, and the algorithm update that Camilla just mentioned. And they do like page speed, but I think expectations are important here, which I'll talk a bit more about that in a minute. People spending more money, which was a really key one, of course. So this was really an extension of the first one. So it was about user experience, and there's loads of data backing this up. Non-angry customers spend more. And I say non-angry because fast pages don't make customers happy by themselves, but slow pages do make them angry. And then finally, the last one was a little bit of a surprise for us and came quite late in the game. So we're currently going through becoming a B Corp, and if others of you are going through this process, you'll know how in depth it is. One thing I was surprised to learn was the carbon footprint created by downloading resource-heavy pages. So there's a link in the resources at the end of this talk to a website that estimates your carbon footprint based on page loads. Now, for our site, based on 1 million page views, let's say, the site produces nearly 6,000 kilograms of CO2. So people tend to relate these stats to going to the moon for some reason. So as if we can all relate to that. So in that vein, that's the same as driving an electric car about a quarter of the way to the moon. Or maybe more relatable, making about 800,000 cups of tea. So that's just based on page loads alone. So this wasn't really a primary reason for us to start with, but it's become a great reason to continue improving our page speed. So we saw some stats at the beginning, and many of you will have seen other stats around this. So here's some from Google and Amazon. 53% of visits are abandoned when your site takes 3 seconds to load. I think the stat that Camilla gave was 40 from a different study, but I think we can agree that it's pretty high. The increase in average order value from a 0.1 second mobile site speed improvement is 9.2%. So you can see how sensitive mobile users are to page speed. So that's just 0.1 seconds. And then finally, I think this one's the big one. $1.6 billion is the amount that Amazon would lose per year from a 1 second page decrease. So that's quite a hard-hitting number. I think all those kind of show kind of the scale of this issue and how sensitive users are to it. So Camilla's already mentioned Core Web Vitals. They are a series of metrics used by Google to measure page experience, and they're focused mostly on speed. And I say mostly because one of them is about layout shifts, but we're going to focus on the speed aspects of them today. Now, they've been around quite a while, but in June, they released an update to include Core Web Vitals in their search ranking algorithm. So let's talk a bit about the update. It's currently rolling out and likely to be completed by August. However, we also saw a huge algorithm update from Google in June and July, which were not page speed related. So it's actually quite difficult to say, oh, well, this affected my site, because there's been just quite a lot of movement at the moment. The good news is, the chances are this Core Web Vitals will be a fairly small effect, and I'll come onto more detail on that in a minute. But just to say that if you have seen a big drop or maybe even a big increase in your Google organic search results, it's probably not down to Core Web Vitals, and it's probably down to these other two algorithm updates that happened in June and July. So here's 5 reasons not to panic. So don't panic just yet. for what it's worth, Google themselves have said the update is lightweight and a tiebreaker. So if you and another site have equally great content, then page speed could be the decider. But generally, it doesn't sound like it's going to be huge, this one. It's important to note that you won't get penalized for a slow page. So this word penalized gets thrown around a lot in SEO. It's not the same as you're not quite as good as the other sites, so Google will rank you lower. It means Google see you breaking their guidelines, usually in a specifically deliberate or obvious way. So that won't happen for a slow page. You're not going to get penalized for it. Now, my sense is that Google are probably being honest about the magnitude of this update, mostly because we've seen this sort of thing before when they pushed out an update around SSL certificates. So they had an update that's saying if you had an SSL certificate, you'd get an SEO boost. And there was a lot of hype around it. Everyone saw it as this potential quick win, but no one really saw much of an effect when it kicked out. So I think we're likely to see a similar thing here. So this probably seems like another push from Google to try and generally improve the web and perhaps cynically reduce their crawling and indexing costs as we reduce our page sizes. So this isn't really a bad thing, but Google will still be looking at content quality and relevance over other signals like page speed. And a final point I want to make on this is you're not alone. Lots of sites are not scoring highly on Core Web Vitals, even really big sites. And I'd probably go as far as to say, especially really big sites. SEO is a bit of a zero-sum game. So if you go down, someone else has to go up. Or to put it another way, in this case, you can't all lose rankings from this at once. So you're not alone in this. And I gave you the good news first. And so that's not to say this update will not have any effect. The first thing is that Google will only give you a boost, and I'm calling it a boost, but in reality, it's probably not that simple. On your page is marked as good in the Search Console page experience report. So I'll show you that report in a minute, but so it's quite an all or nothing kind of update this. You don't get anything for being all right or average. It's all about hitting being in the green and getting a good rating. And the second point is that Core Web Vitals shouldn't be something you do to appease Google. This is something for your customers. And I put this in the panic section because it affects all your channels. So it's not just organic search, and it always has done. So customer expectations are quite high in this area. Your customers won't appreciate that they have to wait for something to load, and they don't even necessarily understand this when they're on slow connections or slow devices. So we mentioned good URLs there. So what are good URLs? So this report is found in Google Search Console, and good URLs have to pass those 4 points on that slide there. So one, they have to pass mobile usability. I'm sure most of you do that. You've probably got mobile responsive sites or a separate mobile site perhaps. Secondly, you have to have no security issues on your site. Well, these are immediately flagged up in Google Search Console, so hopefully you're not in that boat. Third, they have to be served over HTTPS. So hopefully you all do that already. And then the hardest one is what we're talking about, which is having a good status in Core Web Vitals. So just to kind of reiterate here, there's two reports. There's the page experience report, which kind of has those basics as well as the Core Web Vitals aspect. And then there's the Core Web Vitals report, which is this slide. And these are mostly around page speed. And we also talked about the movement of elements on page. So this, you need to get a good report in here in order to get a good mark on the previous report, on the page experience report. That should be the thing that gets you any possible boost that you're going to get from this Core Web Vitals update. So now I'm briefly going to talk about our journey to getting a faster website and what we did. Yours will very likely be different. Different shopping cart software and site designs have very different challenges, but hopefully you can gain something from it. We also have two very in-depth blog posts from our developers, which I've linked to at the end. So at this point, I'd like to show you some stats about how our conversion rate and revenue improved with page speed. Now, I'd like to do that, but I can't. And I'm not saying it didn't contribute for us. We certainly grew considerably year on year, as you can see from this graph. But I can't honestly attribute it to that one thing, because we did a lot of other stuff during that time. And I'd also add that as conversion rate improved, we tended to spend more money on Google AdWords. So we kept a fairly consistent conversion rate and just increased revenue. So it's not, as it ever is, a clear-cut, simple data story. For this reason, I tried to focus on revenue and look at it alongside page speed. So I've picked out 3 Julys in this graph here. So that first one is July 2018. And we saw a pretty good growth of 36% that year. And at that point, we were loading pages at around about 4 seconds on average. And then you can see we had a huge growth in July 2019 as that average started to drop to maybe 3.5 seconds. So I think that was quite a clear point there. And then you can see July 2020, and we're into coronavirus times, and the growth was much more modest. But at that point, we were loading pages at less than 2.5 seconds, maybe 2 seconds on average. So you can at least see the journey that we took in terms of how page speed improved, but it's very difficult for us to pull out information on how that affected revenue directly. So here's what we did to get to that point. So the first thing, we started very low level. We worked on our database first. We moved it to a managed service. Now, a lot of you who are already on things like Shopify won't have this problem. We're on a custom shopping cart, so it was necessary for us to kind of optimize every aspect, all the technical aspects of how the shopping cart worked. The next thing we did was we found that during our shipping and manifesting at the end of the day, that the website was slowing down for our customers. So we had to rewrite some of our code for our back-end processes. We added more servers to cope with this because we knew that this was a really popular time for customers. And that went on for an embarrassingly long time, in fact. That you could expect a slow website at around 5 o'clock on Jewellerybox. Thankfully, this is no longer the case. And the next thing we did was get a whole new website, which didn't really have the effect that we hoped from the start, but it was absolutely necessary to build this, all the rest of the changes that we needed to do in order to get there. So it worked as a good framework. We then got our developers to write a new service around images. So images are such a huge part of page speed. So now when our product team uploads a product image, our system automatically creates sizes for different devices. It goes off and compresses the image losslessly, so it doesn't lose any of its quality. And all of this stuff happens in the background. So that means that when you load our page on a mobile, you'll get a small image and you're not wasting any of that bandwidth downloading our huge 3,000 pixel images. The next thing we did was audit our CSS. So we removed lots of unnecessary rules, pulled out our critical CSS. So these are the styling rules that are necessary for you to load first, the things to get the framework of the page down as quickly as possible. And then finally, we created caching for lots of different page elements. So this means for us, anything that was dynamic, so things like product names or prices or product descriptions, instead of pulling them from our database each time the page was loaded, we would cache those and make them super quick so they were already generated and ready to go. So that made a really big difference to us. And we took it quite far. This was a 3-year journey for us, and any new feature that was added during that time was done with page speed in mind. So, it wasn't a linear journey. As we added new things, we then had to go back and fix other things to make sure that they were loading fast enough. And the culmination of that was that we became the fastest fashion website in the UK, and that's based on largest contentful paint. So that's using a tool called Blackbird, which is a really useful tool. It also tells you how it relates your revenue to your page speed, or attempts to do that, and give you an idea of how much slow pages are costing. So I recommend you check that out. There's a link in the resources at the end of this talk to that tool. So the other thing it did was it changed how we thought about page speed. So it's now a priority on all new features. So if we're adding something to the website, it's one of the things we check. How is this going to affect page speed? And we also regularly audit it to make sure it's not slipping. So every time we do a new redeploy, it's something we check to make sure that those numbers have not gone in the wrong direction. So one of the most important aspects of page speed from a website stakeholder point of view is how do you measure page speed? You need to be able to sell the improvements to higher ups and developers, as well as make sure the improvements you're seeing are being reflected by users in the real world. And the reason it's complex is because loading a web page itself is quite a complex thing. For example, after auditing sites for page speed before, I've ran into this sort of defense from developers more than once. And the page, then they say the page loads really fast. We don't need to do this. We don't need to change anything. And what they've done is they've measured it from their own broadband connection on their own laptop, which is probably super fast. But that's not what your users are doing. Your users are likely a pretty broad demographic. They might live rurally. They might browse your site on the train. They might have terrible broadband at home. They might be in a different country with poor broadband infrastructure like, I don't know, Australia or the US. This is why Google tests its page speed on an old phone on a moderately fast 3G connection. So this is the standard you should aim to meet when we talk about your site loading fast. It's not loading fast on your laptop. It's loading fast on an old device on a slow connection. And that connection is that fast 3G connection, as Google call it. It's around 2% of the speed on a modern 4G connection with decent signal. So it's maybe pretty different than you're seeing even on your own mobile. So one of the takeaways that I've got here is you can try loading your site on a slow device, and you don't need a slow device to do that or a slow connection. You can emulate it in your browser. So you'll notice on this slide, I've got this little F12 key and the Edge and Chrome browser logos. So that means we're going to go into DevTools. So in those two browsers, if you press F12, it will open up developer tools on those browsers. A lot of it might look fairly complex to you, but we're going to go onto one particular tab, and that is the Performance tab. On that tab, you can choose, as is circled on the image there, where it says Network, you can select Fast 3G, and where it says CPU, if you choose 4 times CPU slowdown, that's emulating a slow connection on a fairly slow device. And the other thing with this is, because everything is slowed down, it will also show you the order more easily in which the elements of your page load. And that's a really important aspect of page speed, which we will touch a bit more on in a minute. So loading a lot of data on a slow connection quickly is about perceived page speed. You don't load everything. You make sure the most important things are loaded first. And that forms the basis of about 90% of page speed strategy, with the rest being about making everything as small a file size as possible. So we focus on measuring how fast we can load the first thing the user sees. Now, this metric is called the largest contentful paint, or LCP. So it's one of the core Web Vitals metrics. It's also a great place to start because it focuses on a single element to improve on each page. So if you're just starting your page speed journey, work on LCP first. Users will really notice it, and it's in terms of some of the other page speed changes, it's a fairly simple one to begin with. So the goal with LCP is to find out what your largest contentful paint element is and start loading it before everything else, and then also reduce its size as much as possible. So we're attacking it from 2 sides here. So it's usually an image or a banner, but you need to find out what it is on your site. So as you can see here, we're back into DevTools again, and we're in the Performance tab. So what you're going to do, you're going to go to the Performance tab, you will refresh your page. So I've done it here on the Jewellerybox homepage. And amongst the text that you see, there's a lot of complex graphs there that you can ignore. You'll see the word LCP, or the letters LCP. If you hover over that, you'll see your largest contentful paint element highlighted on your page. So as I say, this is the biggest thing that users will see first when they download your page. And so that's the thing that you're going to start optimizing. So I'm not going to spend too much time on these slides because there's quite a lot to get through, and there's quite a lot to kind of take in here. Obviously, you'll get these slides at the end, but these are some ways to reduce those file sizes. So chances are your largest contentful paint element is an image. So these are some ways to deal with those. And these are some ways to make sure your largest contentful paint element loads first, which is obviously the goal, to make it fast. So the next thing I'm going to talk about is JavaScript. So the challenge I set myself was to make some strategies around JavaScript and improving page speed without being too technical, without it being code or developer focused. So JavaScript was designed originally to add interactive elements to web pages. So things like an add to cart button, analytics tracking, or fancy menus. Nowadays, we tend to use it for just displaying a website. So for example, on our site, we use jQuery, which is a JavaScript library. We have to load that on every page just so things work. And it's become way more prevalent in the modern web thanks to fast connections and fast devices, which we know now, but not everybody has. So JavaScript can come at the cost of speed. And the first thing I do on any website speed audit is to look through what JavaScript a site is loading and question it. So I'm asking whether it's useful. Is it providing you value? And nearly always I'll get, oh, that's an old tool. We installed it last year. We don't use it anymore on something. So these are some of the questions you can ask yourself when you look at the JavaScript that your website is loading, and just decide whether you actually still need it. Because it has a cost, it has a real cost in your page load speed, and that, as we know, translates into actual revenue. I want to say now that JavaScript isn't all bad. It's just that usually it will render last on the page, so that if that JavaScript content is necessary just to see your page, it can make it seem slow. So I'll just go briefly into some detail of how browsers load JavaScript. Now, I know I said I wasn't going to get too technical, but hopefully this is you're all able to understand this. So what happens when the browser loads the page and it comes across a snippet of JavaScript? So it'll pause the current page load. It'll go off and get the JavaScript file. It'll download it, and then it'll run it straight away. So that's one thing that can occur. That's the sort of default behavior. The second type of behavior, now this is becoming more common, is when you use the async tag. You don't really need to know what that is, but essentially what that does is it means the browser will hit the JavaScript and then it will go and download it, but in the background, it will continue rendering the rest of the page. So you might not notice any kind of slowdown from it, but then it will wait right until the end of the page is loaded to run that JavaScript. So both can have a benefit. So if you need that JavaScript to display something on your page, then you should be kind of doing the first one, right? You want to run that quickly. But equally, if that's something like a social sharing button or something that's not vital for customers to see immediately, then it's fine to let it sit at the end of the page, but both in the wrong hands can be non-optimal. So you have to be quite careful about which you're using here. So yeah, it can become a problem if, let's say, lots of JavaScript has to run just to show your product images. That can slow things down. So hopefully I've achieved my goal of making a non-technical JavaScript page speed strategy. It's about seeing JavaScript and plugins as a cost. So even if they're free to use, they may be costing you in page speed, which, as we know, cost you in real money too. So ask your developers, what is this JavaScript doing? And don't assume that just because something's really quick to implement, like we've all had those things where it's like one click to install this plugin that will tell you all this great data about your customers. It's not always going to be quick to load. So just kind of keep an eye on that. That's how you get things sort of creeping to be slower and slower when you start adding all of these extra bits of JavaScript to your site. So again, the starting point is finding the information first. So how do you know what JavaScript you're loading? So this is quite easy. If you go to DevTools again, if you go to the Network tab, you'll see a button that says Filter for JS, and then refresh the page. And what you'll see there is just a list of all the external JavaScript files that your site loads. And you can go through that maybe with your developer and make sure that they're all absolutely necessary, and make sure that you're using those tools. So while we're on the subject of JavaScript, I want to talk a little bit about what we did to optimize fresh relevance content for our site. So I'm going to go quite quick here because I can see that I'm actually on 24 minutes and this is supposed to be a 25-minute presentation. But we started by adding fresh relevant content via the API. So this means it was done on our server, not on our user's end. We then added caching for non-personalized content. So we have bestseller sliders on our product pages. They're not personalized. They take information about how well a product is selling and to decide what to display for each product. So this means we didn't have to go and load them from Fresh Relevance each time. We had them ready to go, and then each night it would go and grab the new set of data from Fresh Relevance. And then finally, the biggest challenge here was for personalized content. So obviously we couldn't cache that for everybody because then they'd all see the same content. So we cached it per user. So if that user came back, we could serve the content from our cache and not have to reload from Fresh Relevance. So you can see the two sliders here. They're actually very similar looking, but they do come with different data. The other aspect of this is that the slider caches, if we don't get a quick enough response from Fresh Relevance for any reason, then it falls back to our own data. So we can just show some sort of more generic bestsellers, which means that kind of all bases are covered. So finally, I always like to get some quick wins at a talk. So something I can go back to the office and implement straight away. So I've tried to give some in this webinar. These first two are from a guy called Dave Perris, who works for PropellerNet. He runs a tool called Blackbird, which I mentioned earlier in the thing. So it attempts to show you how much your slow pages are costing you in revenue. So here's the tip. Loading jQuery. So jQuery is a JavaScript library. Chances are your site probably uses it. If your site uses Cloudflare as well, then you should load jQuery using from your own domain and not from Google's. The general advice is to load it from Google's domain because they have servers all over the world and they can load it fast because they're close to your users. The second reason for this advice is the assumption that so many sites use jQuery that your users will have it cached on their own browser already. Now, this has changed over time. People are often using more privacy browsers, so they're not caching as much. They're clearing caches between visits. And there's also so many versions of jQuery, minified and non-minified and different version numbers, and also from different URLs that you can't really rely on it being cached. That's actually quite a rare thing now. So this old advice is not bad advice, but if you use something like Cloudflare, which caches your content, serves it really fast from servers all over the world from your own domain, you'll probably be better off serving jQuery from there and not Google's. And so the why on this is the slow bit of getting jQuery from Google is the connection to their domain and negotiating their SSL certificate and all the overhead that that brings. So if you load it from your own domain, all that's already been done. And a little bonus tip here is do use a CDN like Cloudflare. And just a quick note, if you're on Shopify, it already has Cloudflare built in. So all you need to do is upload jQuery to Shopify and serve it straight from there. Now, I haven't tested this on Shopify, but I see no reason why it shouldn't work. Second bonus tip is you can also try this with Google fonts. Rather than loading them from Google, load them from your own server. Hopefully that's not too complex to understand, but the next one is even more simple, I promise. So this is a really simple tip which can save your users up to 1 second on a 3G connection. So it's around EV SSLs. If you have one, you should swap it for a regular SSL. There's no extra security benefit, and there's not even a visual clue in modern browsers anymore. So you used to get these big green bars, like in that PayPal example there, but you don't even get those anymore. So PayPal's site just shows the normal padlock, the same as any other secure website. So if you use an EV SSL certificate, switch to a regular SSL certificate for a speed boost. That's the tip. The why on this one is pretty dry and boring. So feel free to Google OCSP stapling if you really can't sleep at night. But your best bet is just to do the tip. If you're not sure what SSL you use, you can go to that website there and you can look for extended validation, yes or no. So if it's a yes, then you can get a really easy speed boost by switching. And my final quick win, because I can see I'm way over time now, is lazy loading images without JavaScript. So lazy loading is the practice of not loading your images when the users load the page, but only if they scroll down to the image. So it saves a ton of time because your site's loading way less data, and it can build the page much faster. You used to have to do this with JavaScript, but on most modern browsers, you can now do it really easily using HTML. So something like that. So if you notice the loading equals lazy tag in there, and the two caveats to this are you should only do this for images that are down the page. So you don't want to do it for your initial banner or your logo at the top, because you want those to load completely not lazily. You want them to load first. So any images that are down the page, you can add this tag to. Second caveat is that this isn't supported by Safari browser. It won't break anything for Safari users. They just won't get the same benefit as Chrome, Edge, and Firefox. But it is recognized in Google PageSpeed scores. And as a final bonus tip, you can also do this with iframe. So some video embeds would allow you to do this too. So it would only load them as you scroll down the page and not immediately. I'm not really going to go through these now, but yeah, these are some resources. So some of them I've talked about, and some of them are extra little bonuses. So feel free to peruse those at your leisure. And I've also made a quick to-do list. So there's nothing new here. This just summarizes everything I've talked about, but hopefully kind of breaks it down into things that you can go back to the office and work on straight away. And that's everything. So thank you for listening. I'm sorry it was delivered so quickly, but I had a lot to go through in very limited time. So hopefully you managed to get something from it. Back to you, Camilla.
A huge thank you to you, Nathan, for sharing your expertise and your passion for site speed. It's really inspiring. I'm feeling inspired, and I hope our audience are as well. So we do have some time for some questions, and I see that we've had some good ones coming in. So I'm going to start with this one from Cora from Pavers. Thank you, Cora, for this question. Could you please explain the correlation between AOV, so average order value, and site speed?
I can't. So that study was done by Google, and it wasn't they weren't really looking for a causation there. But my guess would be that customers who are willing to click around the site are probably more likely to do so when those pages are loading, really quick. And so therefore they're more likely to add more things to their basket. That would be my guess, but I don't think the study really went into the reasons for that.
Okay, thank you for that. And a question from Louis. Would implementing an interactive slideshow on our homepage affect the speed of our website?
So it could. It's quite a big question. The way you implement things like that is absolutely key. So I think that's something to talk to developers about, isn't it? That making page speed an absolute priority when adding new features. So, I mean, I think there's really no element that you can't add to your website because page speed is going to take a hit. But the way you implement it is everything. So what you'd be doing with the slideshow is making sure that if it's not at the top of your page, you make sure that it's lazy loaded. One of the other things you can do is you don't load all the images in the slideshow straight away. So when the person swipes or clicks, you make that the event on which you load the next image, rather than loading all 5 images at once or 10 images at once. Another thing you can do is make sure all your images are compressed and served at the right size. So that's kind of a basic housekeeping thing. So there's lots of kind of aspects. So if you created your slideshow like that, then yeah, certainly there's no reason it should affect your page speed too negatively.
Thank you. Some practical tips there. And that actually leads quite nicely to another question, which is, are there any elements of your website you would sacrifice page speed for? So how do you achieve the right balance between content and page speed?
So I'm usually the one telling my developers to add something, and they're usually the ones pushing back and saying, oh no, it's going to make things too slow. So that tends to be how that battle goes. There's probably not really anything that I would say, oh no, we can't have this because it loads too slow. If I give you an example, we recently implemented a quite cool thing on our homepage actually that lets you shop or lets your users shop via Instagram. So it shows your Instagram feed and your products are tagged in each picture, and you can go and click on the image on Instagram and it'll take you to the product page. Now, the original, when I originally implemented this on our staging server, our developers quickly realized that it was pulling 3,000 pixel images from Instagram. So it added something like 32 megabytes to our page loads. So once we realized that, we had a choice of, we're going to have to find another piece of software that does this, or we're going to have to find a way to change it. So what we ended up doing, our developers found a way to cache the images, found a way to compress the images, so they weren't using up that page weight. So I don't really think there's anything that can't be implemented, but some things require more work to get them to a kind of acceptable state.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. And then there's also another question here from Josh, which is, are there any quick, easy wins that you can do to improve page speed? So we've already kind of gone through the 3 quick wins that you so nicely laid out at the end. I don't know if there's any of those that you would recommend starting with, or I don't know how you'd want to answer that.
Well, in terms of which ones are easiest to implement, so 2 of them depend on your website. So the EVSSL one is certainly like really easy to implement, might not even require a developer, but you can only kind of get the benefit if you happen to be using an EVSSL, so it's not going to be applicable to everyone. The jQuery one is probably going to work for most websites, because I think most websites nowadays, especially e-commerce, tend to use jQuery in some capacity. That's pretty easy to implement. Again, it's just replacing one bit of JavaScript for another. So one call to an external file and moving that onto your own website instead of Google's. So again, I think, that is super easy. Hopefully wouldn't require a developer for that one. I don't have anything else right off the top of my head. I hope 3 would be enough for you.
Yeah, I think you provided enough information.
If I think of anything, then I will let you know.
Thanks, Nathan. And then just finally, you mentioned you frequently audit your page speed. So how often do you have a frequent amount of time, like a regular amount of time that you do that?
So the way it works for us is, now this is something you can actually automate, but we haven't actually done that yet. But when we redeploy, I will go in and test the page speed again on the different types of pages. So the home page, the category page, and a product page, to make sure they haven't dropped. So that's the kind of basic aspect of it. And if there's a major change there, then we may end up rolling back the deploy and figuring out what had gone wrong. So that's kind of the scope of regular auditing. But I mean, that can also be built into your deployments, your continuous integration. So you could make that sort of as a kind of automated test. So as your deployment went live, you could say, well, I'm going to stop the deployment if it scores lower than a certain page speed, for example. There's quite a lot you can do there, but the process itself doesn't have to be too in depth. It's really just me looking to see is there a problem? Has things got considerably slower? It's trying to stop that slip. As you add new features, is the website just gradually getting slower and slower and slower?
Yeah, that sounds like a really good rule of thumb, and like a nice way to keep it simple is just thinking, each time you add something, check and see if it's making your website slower.
Yeah.
Great. Well, I'm just going to quickly share my screen again. So thank you very much again, Nathan. You've really shared so much useful information there, and I hope that everyone's enjoyed this session. And as I said, if you do have any questions, here are our contact details, and we'll be on hand to answer any questions after the event. And we also do have a brand new checklist out, just released, which is all about auditing your page speed. So there are some really, really practical, kind of easy to follow tips there, and it's packaged in a really nice checklist. So that's available to download on our website now. And yes, thank you once again, Nathan, and thank you everyone for joining us. It's been a really great, insightful lunch and learn, and thanks again.
No problem. Thanks everybody. And if you do have any questions that we didn't cover here, then please get in touch with me on LinkedIn or my emails there, and I will do my best to help you out.
Thank you very much.